There is light somewhere.
One discovers the light in darkness. That is what darkness is for.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Thorne Auditorium and Occidental College. I'm Mary Beth Heffernan, Chair of the Department of Art and Art History. I'm delighted to welcome you to the opening event in our second year of the Oxy Live series. Oxy Live is conceived and curated by the college's community arts hub, Oxy Arts, and its director, Meldia Yesayan. Oxy Arts is funded through a generous support of Occidental trustee and alumna Lisa Casino, class of '85, the Occidental alumni class of 1974, and LA's top NPR station. We're incredibly grateful for their support. I'm touched that alumni care about our experience on our campus here and now. Many of you know that tonight's featured speaker, artist Tavares Strachan, and his work dovetails with the current exhibition Invisibility, Powers and Perils at Oxy Arts. The Oxy Arts exhibition is part of the Getty Museum's Pacific Standard Time programming, Art and Science Collide. And as part of that, one of Strachan's iconic works, the Encyclopedia of Invisibility, is on display there. I was moved that he characterized this work, this incunabulum of over 17,000 entries of lost, forgotten, or overlooked BIPOC pioneers, as talking to his younger self. In turn, I hope that this work and this night speaks to your younger selves in the audience tonight, letting you know that you too can write yourself into the script. You can use art, science, or whatever your métier to make space for yourself, to your vision and your voices. One of the hallmarks of Occidental's liberal arts education is that all students develop artistic and scientific literacy. I'm grateful for Oxy for encouraging me to teach my own practice combining art and medicine. As an artist and faculty member, Oxy Live events make me feel even more connected to these larger conversations. It affirms that Oxy is one of my artistic and intellectual homes. It feeds me, and I feel the gratitude for gathering together in person and being part of Oxy and the Los Angeles communities. Our interlocutor for tonight is the protean Paul Holdengräber, best described as a curator of public curiosity. He was the founding executive director of Onassis Los Angeles. Previously, for 14 years, he was the founder and director of Live from the New York Public Library, a cultural series where he interviewed the likes of Patti Smith and Zadie Smith, the late Ricky Jay and Jay-Z, Wes Anderson, Laurie Anderson, and Helen Mirren, among many, many others. He hosted over 600 events and cemented the library's reputation as a center for free, open public discourse and debate. Before his tenure at the library, Holdengräber was the founder and director of the Institute for Art and Cultures at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and a fellow at the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles. Our distinguished guest tonight is the artist Tavares Strachan, whose artistic practice activates the intersection of art, science, politics, and uniquely synthesizes points of view on the cultural dynamics of scientific knowledge. Aeronautics, astronomy, deep sea exploration, and extreme climatology are but some of the thematic arenas of which Strachan creates monumental allegories that tell of cultural displacement, human aspiration, and mortal limitation. Themes of invisibility, displacement, and loss are central to his work, which questions historically canonized narratives that marginalize or obscure others. His text-based neon sculptures are an anthem for our political and cultural moment, and his lexicon, an effort to mobilize community and societal change. Strachan earned a BFA in glass from the Rhode Island School of Design in 2003, and has an MFA in sculpture from Yale University in 2006. He has exhibited internationally and received numerous prestigious awards, including the MacArthur Foundation Fellowship in 2022. Paul, you are one of the most gifted and well-prepared interlocutors of our time. And Tavares, You once reflected that your art is about connecting with the audience, about being close to the audience. Paul and Tavares, I wish that for you and our engagement tonight. Welcome to Occidental College.
For you. Tavares, it's a great, great pleasure to have you here tonight. I would like to start by listening. And I would like for us to start with some gumbo type listening. I felt it was important to begin this way. There's a story to this track for you. And it's a story really which, in a way, is a seed of a lot of your work, it seems to me. This discovery of what this song means and how we come upon things. We might say it was a portal for you, an opening. So perhaps you could tell us what this song means and how the very young Tavares, maybe 7, maybe 8, maybe 9, maybe 10, heard this music for the first time and then came to understand its importance.
First and foremost, that was extremely moving and surprising. So thank you.
You inspired it.
I would say that the 7 or 8-year-old me was living in a time when self-belief was discouraged. And I think it's no dissimilar to the moment we're in at the current time. And the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey was a human being who had an immeasurable, insane self-belief set of systems and values. It was so immense, his belief in self, that in the early 1900s he had over 6 million followers. He wasn't on Instagram, that's for sure.
Can I just ask the sound to make it a little less bass? I'm having some trouble hearing, forgive me.
Should I get closer?
No, yeah, get closer. What I read about this song is that you wrote the Honorable Marcus Garvey was introduced to me in a burning spear song, which is what we just heard. Old Marcus Garvey, when I was in primary school, I was exposed to a new kind of black consciousness through this music and began to study the teachings of Garvey. So the song was an opening. And I think it's so interesting, you know, how we come upon things. On a personal level, I remember that my older son came to me one day and said, "Papa, have you read Aristotle's Metaphysics?" I was surprised, and I can't claim to have read Aristotle's Metaphysics, but I did remember the first line of it. And I said, well, I didn't really read it, but you know, he begins the book by saying that man naturally gravitates towards knowledge. And then I said, Sam, where does this query, this question come from? And he said, well, I was listening to the Flatbush Zombies, and they mention Aristotle's Metaphysics. It's a funny story, but in a way, how we come upon things is an incredibly profound, it profoundly reveals how we learn. And so if what I said triggers something in your own upbringing and in your own ways of discovering, I'd love you to share it with us.
I agree that the things that bring us to our craft ends up being the subject of our craft, yeah? So my discovery, or his discovery of me, if you will, like he did through music, many of the youth in my neighborhood, it was a way to transcend and traverse and transgress a system that was predicated on keeping any reflection of one's identity from the system, right? And, you know, Bob notoriously says, Rasta don't work for no CIA. So the fact that the might and the power of the culture was in the hands of the artist in a system that was predicated on keeping that information from the community. The fact that the misfits and the derelicts and the rejects of the society were the ones who were delivering the most valuable medicine to the people, it makes sense that if that was the way that I found art, if you will, if you want to call it that.
You don't want to call it that necessarily.
No, I don't.
Why?
So I guess we're speaking the truth to each other tonight.
At least a version of it.
Well, how about this? How about we agree to forcefully pursue the truth?
I'm in agreement.
I think I never grew up feeling empowered by this thing called art. And I think so much of what my curiosity is about this examination of this thing that we call art. Because I think this thing that we call art is a system of power, like any other system of power. And I'm interested in systems, and I think Burning Spears were interested in systems. I think the song that we just heard was an interrogation of a system. I think the work of Marcus Garvey was an interrogation of a system. And I think that, in the words of the great Dr. Cornel West, if a nation is sleepwalking, then they cannot be saved.
You know, I was thinking that you might bring up the important issue of power, and it brought to my mind a wonderful passage of June Jordan, where she says, most of the time, power has to do with dominance. Poetry is powerful, but it cannot even aspire to dominate anyone. It means making a connection. That's what it means. And she also says, since we're talking truth to each other, poetry is a political act because it involves telling the truth. And I'm wondering how these two thoughts resonate with you.
I believe every artist is in dialogue with their childhood self. And I think that's true for every practitioner. I think the best doctor in the world, the best orator, the best watchmaker, I think they were inspired by their early self. And they're deeply trying to communicate. And I think that desire to communicate is connected to them trying to find the inner child, which is a version of truth. Yeah? And so when I said that, when I made that statement to you earlier about telling each other the truth, or at least the pursuit of it, I think that's where you can begin to find yourself, is when you're honestly prioritizing the child in you.
Sort of removing the masks that aging puts on you.
Unlearning, if you will. A lot of unlearning.
But back to Garvey for a moment, because he is really important in your work. I think of the way in which, in a recent exhibition, you highlight an unfinished project he had, which I'd love you. I don't have slides for that because there shouldn't be too many, though there are quite a few. If you could give a sense of your adventure with his ship, and how you felt you needed to save that ship from oblivion.
So when I went to school, I learned about Roman Signer and Bruce Nauman, David Hammonds, and I think it was very fortunate that I think Garvey predates those conceptualists, because I think he was a conceptualist. And he had a big vision, and his vision was to simply prioritize oneself, which sounds kind of crazy, even today, that something so simple sounds so radical. To tell a bunch of displaced people to prioritize themselves was a crazy thought to have, in 1920, for example. So he believed this so much that he amassed a idea for a shipping line called the Black Star Line. And he amassed 3 ships and raised the funds and had this vision of allowing diasporic people to have free movement. Again, all of these things sound so crazy. I think the simplicity of the idea is, for me, so profound. And again, the audacity of self-belief. That that
the audacity of self-belief.
Yeah.
And
unfortunately, the young Garvey was met with an even younger J. Edgar Hoover, who became the then director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the state project began, and Garvey was the first on the list to eliminate. And he was then eliminated before the ships could go across the Atlantic and take people who are freely desiring to return to Africa.
And so Tavares steps in, and no, but he does step in the way, Julie Merettu stepped in to save Nina Simone's home, in ways that are not so different. You step in to save the ship, but saving the ship is not enough. It's saving really the idea of what the ship promised.
I think that question makes me think about relief efforts in the developing world versus the developed world, if we could use that barbaric language. And I think relief is oftentimes misunderstood in terms of what a group of people might or might not need in a particular place of need, right? And that's a very long-winded way of saying that. It's difficult to understand the complexity of need in the kaleidoscope of the human experience. And food and water is in Maslow's kind of hierarchy, but I think the people need art, right? or the other word that you and I are going to come up with before we leave here today. And for that reason, it's important for people in the diaspora, specifically people in the Caribbean, to imagine a world with bread and water, but also a world that has, Foucault, a world that has burning spears, a world that has Derek Walcott, et cetera, et cetera. You need all of it. I mean, you can drop bales of rice, but that's not going to save the people.
So you used the word Caribbean. So there is Tavares. I'm bringing you back to the Tavares that lives in the Bahamas and dreams of elsewhere. Dreams of, I'm reminded of the wonderful line of Zora Neale Hurston, who said, "Ships at a distance have every man's wish on board." There you are thinking about leaving, and saving this ship is, in a way, a notion of the elsewhere, going elsewhere. And it brings to mind this wonderful line of Bob Dylan, who says, "You can always go back, but you can always go." What's the exact word? No, you can always come back, but you never can come back all the way, right? So I'm curious what this diaspora of Tavares was, leaving that small little island that had given you so much, and finding a new makeshift home elsewhere.
Yeah. I think there's always an impressive beauty in misunderstanding. I think misunderstandings have a way of countering ego. And I think if we operate within a place of misunderstanding, or at least a perceived misunderstanding, then I think there's a certain level of awareness for the known world that we hit, like a higher level of understanding of the known world that we hit with this kind of weapon of misunderstanding on our side, right? Because you don't go in with the assumption that you know something about something. And I think it was important for me to leave, in a way. I worked on boats growing up. It's the way I made my school money, my uniform money. We wore uniforms, and I would buy my uniforms because I would fish for money and sell fish, and the fish would then go towards my uniform money. But what was magical about those experiences was, when you live on an island that's 21 by 7 miles, it's relatively easy to be in the middle of nowhere by, riding for half an hour in a boat, and then you can go out and stargaze, which is one of the most egalitarian experiences that exist, and it connects to all of us, right? So those experiences at least signaled to me that there was something else. And it allowed me to tap into my imagination. Are we doing all right? Are we doing all right?
We're doing very well. I'm trying to think to myself what would be best now. And part of me just wants to look up at the stars and be silent. But that wouldn't be right for this occasion, I don't think. There is this idea, which I think is prevalent in your work as I understand it, of cartography. Of mapping. And there's a a writer who I adore named Sarah Broom. I don't know if you know her, but she's really a magnificent writer, and I highly recommend to everybody The Yellow House. It's a story about a house in New Orleans. I won't say very much more, but she has 2 epigraphs, and I want to read them to you because I remembered them late last night. I'm having trouble speaking, forgive me. And they really made me think of your work. One is by Kai Miller and the other is by Peter Turchi. And the Kai Miller line is, "Draw me a map of what you see, then I will draw a map of what you never see, and guess me whose map will be bigger than whose." That's Kai Miller. And then Peter Turchi writes, "To learn how to read any map is to be indoctrinated into the map maker's culture." So I'd like you to, in some way, respond to that, thinking that I'm slowly but surely leading you into the Encyclopedia of Invisibility.
How about Robert Irwin?
Robert Irwin?
Yeah. Seeing is forgetting the thing that you saw.
Yeah.
That's my only response to that.
Well, it has a virtue of concision. Say more. The overlooked. The overlooked, whether it is for deliberate reasons or not.
I love thought experiments. I think
We're having one.
yeah, that's why I'm getting closer. I think the Black Star Line was a thought experiment, is a thought experiment. And I like thought experiments because they're expansive, right? I think the best artists make to make again, and work makes work. So, for example, the Encyclopedia of Invisibility is a thought experiment. And it takes its root from all of the music I grew up listening to, which was to get you to make, right? There were verbs. It was action sound, right? Like the word became flesh and dwelt among men and roamed around like giants. So for me, the idea is that if you could imagine all of the things that exist in a particular zeitgeist, I figured you'd like that word.
You're getting me. No, zeitgeist is a word that I use it quite frequently.
Okay. All right.
Whenever
We'll come
I
back.
can.
We can come back to it a bunch of times, yeah. But if you can imagine everything that exists within parameters of what's known, then you can imagine what exists in the unknown. And then it becomes a collaborative exercise to think that through. And it may manifest itself in a book or a painting or a sculpture, but it manifests itself mostly in one's imagination. And through that, it becomes a kind of shared consciousness. So it really is not about a particular object or a singular experience. I think it's a kind of unified experience. I think that's the goal for me, at least, that I make things that inspire more making and more thinking and more sharing. And it changes me and it changes the viewer and the audience in the same way.
So, Tavares, let's talk about this extraordinary undertaking that is the Encyclopedia of Invisibility. let's look at it first of all. Just a few slides. Maybe we'll begin with 4 and then 5.
Yeah,
and you can talk over it for sure.
I mean, this makes me think of Leonardo da Vinci in a sense, like the idea of effort. And
of effort?
Effort, yeah, on the way to making something. You know, there's something about mastery, that the effort to make something should go unrevealed, right? Otherwise you lose the mastery. The mastery is in the concealment of the effort.
A dancer knows where they put their feet.
Yeah. So I think I've said the thing already.
It's going to be interesting, but I will try. I'm up for the challenge. What is this? What are we seeing? What are we seeing that took 10 years?
15.
15, and probably, I imagine, is not finished. I imagine probably it's never going to be finished. Like the Encyclopedia Britannica, which I grew up with, as did you. My father bought me the whole thing, and then later on I got the OED, also 20 volumes, but I got it in the small little, we can leave one up there. I got the small little 2-volume one with magnifying glass. But I remember when my father bought this to me in the hopes that I would be educated, he, from time to time, would get the supplement to the Britannica because it was an unfinished work. Now we don't consult books in the same way. I don't know how many people consult encyclopedias in the same way. But there comes Tavares saying, maybe you are not consulting an encyclopedia, but guess what? I'm going to make an encyclopedia, and I'm not going to make it alone because I can't. I started maybe alone, but I then needed all kinds of people to work with me. They won't be named, like in many encyclopedias, you don't know who wrote it, but it will be kind of a disembodied voice. And in that encyclopedia, you will find things that maybe you won't find elsewhere.
Do you believe that there's an inherent violence?
I believe in?
That there's an inherent violence in making something, putting something into the world?
Goodness me, the table is turned. Yes. I mean, yes, in the sense that, yes, I mean, construction, destruction, yes.
So, if you think about how we evolved, human beings that is, 250,000 years ago, like imagine us bare-chested in the wilderness with the wildebeest and all of the cats, all of the poisonous snakes, and the fragility of our bodies and the fact that we can't manage temperature very well. And just imagine what it took for us to make it out of that to where we are now, right? And you think of, like, if you've seen animals on other animals, you could imagine the inherent aggression that goes along with having to kill something to feed your family. So I think a lot about the violence that is a part of making, but also the violence that it is being a human being. So my question to you is, how do you make a whole slew of Encyclopedia of Britannica without violence?
And then my question to you, it's an old technique, is how do you counter that violence by creating something that resurrects, as it were, all the voices that in one way or another have been, if you want to be sweet about it, have been overlooked. If you want to be a little more accurate about it, have been silenced. If you want to be a little more violent about it, have been obfuscated and destroyed.
Was this mic just cut?
Yeah, my mic seems to... Pardon? My mic... Does this mic... No? No?
We don't need it.
Okay, we don't need it. So, the Encyclopedia of Invisibility... We're fine? Okay, we'll just go like this. I mean, you know, we're so close now.
Yeah, let's get closer.
Yeah, get closer. The Encyclopedia of Invisibility is... there, thank you very much. The Encyclopedia of Invisibility is what? What is it? What do we find there? What is it that, what is ambition? What is Leonardo da Vinci in Tavares that took on this extraordinary feat of endurance?
In its most naked form,
Yeah.
it is a portal into the imagination of the people. It is to say to the people that we can drive, that we get to determine what society is, what culture is, in a world where we are oftentimes being controlled by the algorithm, right? So I think it's a thought experiment. The way that you counter the violence is through the imagination, right? It's not with brick and mortar or, you know, guns and roses. It's through the imagination. So it's a thought experiment. It's like, would everyone join us on this thought experiment? You know, what happens if we made our own encyclopedia?
And what happens when you do? So I went, there's an extraordinary exhibition happening at Oxy Arts, which is down the street. If you haven't gone, please go. It's called Invisibility, Powers and Perils, beautifully, beautifully curated, and there, prominently featured under glass or under plexiglass, is a book, which is there. It's open, so this is not a good image of it. And for anybody such as myself, who has, I think, there it is. I don't know if it was open at that, but thank you very much. I mean, the people in the back are doing beautifully. Thank you so much. But I suffer from a strong desire for tactile inebriation, and so I requested that Mildia, and she agreed, which was lovely, that Mildia let me touch with gloves this object. And it was extraordinary. And I can't tell you, Tavares, what it felt like to whenever you consult an encyclopedia, you invariably learn a lot of things. But what I saw immediately was just how strange, how uncanny it was to be amongst its pages.
So quite seriously, was it a real book?
What's a real book?
No. Was this thing you saw a real book?
Yes.
And what are the tenets? What were the faculties of this that made it a real book for you?
What happens between the covers? 2,000, this could be interpreted in many ways, I know, but 2,500 pages with entries like Samuel Taylor Coleridge. I thought it was a poet, but I was far from the truth. It was they called him the African Gustav Mahler, an entry on domestic labor, which is fantastic, which is invisible work, sort of going to the core of what the encyclopedia itself is. Harlem Cultural Festival, which I knew a little bit about thanks to Questlove and his wonderful movie, what was the name of the movie? The Summer of, forgetting now. The Summer of Soul. Then there are names that I recognize, like Robert Hayden, not invisible really, but not spoken about, one of the first poets, certainly the first American poet laureate. And then I came upon people who had become familiar to me thanks to Tavares. And those two names were Edwin Perry and Matthew Henson. And so what's interesting about the encyclopedia also is it's referential to your own work and to your own artwork. So maybe you can highlight for me some of those entries, and I would say most prominently and perhaps most deeply Henson and Perry, because I think it's really interesting to discover who these people were, and in order to do so, if you could put up slide number 35.
So much of how I think about process is observation and looking, and there's a certain power in looking. I think there's always been a power in the gaze. So looking is a critical kind of elastic exercise, right? It's infinite looking. I kind of fell in love with the idea of looking. And I think to say that one finds something is quite peculiar. And a good example of this is, as a student of exploration, when I made my first trek to the North Pole, the first thing one discovers is...
Did you hear that, by the way? When it's said in...
We covered this over the Da Vinci thing, mastery, effortlessness.
I went to the North Pole on my first trip. I just want people to take in the fact that happened. So when I went to the North Pole, it's a sentence I've never uttered before, but go ahead.
The North Pole is on an ice shelf, which means it's a shelf that's hovering above the ocean, solid. And it is a mathematical calculation. You know when you're at the absolute north by using devices. You put your flag into the pole, if you will, and then you participate in what I call an ideological experiment, in the sense that as soon as you put the flag down, you're no longer at the pole because it's floating, and there's no way to anchor the flag below the ocean at the exact North Pole. So almost every photo you see of someone at the North Pole, they're not at the North Pole. So I think that the process of looking is quite fascinating. And I think there's this thing about, the fear of death, right? That we need to capture the moment. We need to hold on to the thing. And so the reason why I was going to the North Pole was because I'd learned of this explorer named Matthew Henson, a polar explorer, probably the most important person in the 20th century, at least for me. And that is because he, along with Robert Perry, discovered the North Pole, and his contributions to those efforts were more or less erased, if we're being kind. And I found the fact that it took me so long to find his story fascinating. I think it's fascinating. I think as a piece of observational math, I think the fact that someone could do something so big in 1909, this is a big deal. This is like going into space then.
We might get to that, I'm not sure. I mean, Tavares has had, to put it in a nice way, he's had a colorful life, but go ahead.
So I think my curiosity in going to the pole was inspired by the great Matthew Henson, who had gone to the pole in 1909, and just imagine what the world was like in 1909 for a man that looked like me. So he was at the North Pole in 1909.
And where was he from?
He grew up in Maryland, but he spent a lot of time between Maryland and Illinois, and moved around. Worked with Perry since he was 14. Traveled through Central America. He was an explorer. He worked on boats. He fished like me. He hunted and trapped, or I fished like him rather. And then he found himself on a few polar expeditions. There's stories upon stories. We can keep going if you'd like me to. Okay, I'll keep going then.
Well, keep going. In part, I'll trigger something, which is there is Tavares needing, in order to make this thought experiment, it isn't just a thought experiment, it's an embodied experiment. You need to be there, doing what he did. You need to be there the same way I think of Werner Herzog needing to bring the ship over the mountain. You need, it's an athletic experience. So the aesthetic experience and the athletic experience are one.
Can you do me a favor?
I can do you two.
Can you explain the Holy Trinity to me? The Holy Trinity in like 3 sentences.
No. Can you?
I don't think the audience believe you. They don't think you didn't really try, did you?
I didn't.
Yeah. Could you try? I'll help you. Like the 3 and the 1 and the 1 and the 3.
They're all one in the end, yes.
But
they're 3.
That's weird, right?
It is weird. Okay, I did. And?
I think it's like explaining anything else. I think it's to me, the reason why I asked that question is because I think you show someone a piece of sculpture and you're like, well, this artist is interested in these 4 or 5 ideas. And they're like, oh, we don't really get it. And then you say the Holy Trinity, they're like, oh, got it. And I find that fascinating. That our brains are wired, our synapses could be wired to understand something so complex, so simply in one regard and then in another regard. You know, the idea that when you go to a pole, you put a pole down, and it absolutely makes no sense that you're taking a photo of a place that doesn't exist, because it doesn't really exist. It's a conceptual idea. It's kind of like the Holy Trinity thing, the 3 and the 1 and the 1 and the 3.
I feel enlightened. But what I was trying to get to is also this notion of there you are, reclaiming a space of erasure. And in the encyclopedia, you have a wonderful line from Henson's autobiography, and the autobiography is called The Black Explorer at the North Pole. Another world's accomplishment was done and finished. And as in the past, from the beginning of history, wherever the world's work was done by a white man, he had been accompanied by a colored man.
Isn't that fascinating?
It is fascinating.
So my work is to share that fascination with everyone, and have everyone find that thing as fascinating as I did. And I think somewhere in there is the reason for doing all of it.
It's a work of, one might say, of recovery, but really also a work of salvation.
Hey now.
Hey now.
You did not want to talk about the Trinity. Now we're on the salvation.
Something happened.
Oh no. Salvation.
Yeah, but true. Saving from obliteration, recovering the shards of what has been decimated, of what has been obliterated, of what has been overlooked, unspoken. Reminds me of the great 19th century French historian who said that le rôle c'est de faire parler les silences de l'histoire. The role of the historian is to make the silences of history speak.
So then how do you explain Sisyphus?
Well, moving right along. What's interesting about the encyclopedia is also, the entries, right? There's an entry about dub, and that would be interesting given the music we heard at the beginning. There's an entry about Moondog, about Robert Henry Lawrence. Maybe say something about Robert Henry Lawrence. Never heard about him until 2 days ago when I had the great good fortune of consulting the encyclopedia.
That makes me think of the snake chasing his tail, like with Sisyphus, if you don't mind.
I don't mind.
I think when we'll talk about Robert Smalls more accurately, but I think the reason why I brought up Sisyphus is because I think there's something about civilization, the human experience, human beings, humankind, that loves to push the rock up the hill and let it roll back. And I think a part of that is ignoring that we share consciousness, like this is a shared consciousness. And the idea that like Henson is black and Perry is white is mostly illusion. And the idea that Robert Henry Lawrence could have this desire to go into space and was probably going to end up on the moon was just a fascinating story to me as a human being. And I think that might have been fascinating to me irregardless of where I was born and what I look like. I think these stories are just interesting as human stories because we are the same thing. And I think the Sisyphusian stories, we trick ourselves into believing that that if we keep eating our tails, that we'll somehow survive, but we won't.
I remember, the last line of Camus' great essay on the myth de Sisyphe is, il faut imaginer Sisyphe heureux. We must imagine Sisyphus happy. It would be an obvious thing to say that this undertaking of this encyclopedia is Sisyphean. It is without end. There's one entry in...
But wait one second. I love that you ignored the Sisyphus thing, but you're like the world's foremost expert on Sisyphus.
Well, I maybe for that reason. There's one entry which I adore, which in a way is again a seed for the book. I knew about it a little bit, but not the way I discovered it last night when I was reading more about it, which is an entry called Damnatio Memoria, which is a Latin phrase meaning a condemnation of memory, removal of a corrupt figure from historical accounts. This method of erasure is typically enacted against those perceived to have brought dishonor to a ruling body, an erasure of all traces. So in that sense, the dictionary of the Encyclopedia of Invisibility is this reclaiming, this counter-damnation. Let's bring from oblivion what has been suppressed, what has been erased. And I always love the English word for remember is so good, right? Because it literally means putting the members back together, as in a whole body. So there is that kind of Sisyphean, with my lisp I can't say it, Sisyphean. I can't do it. I mean, I really, it's like when the first time I was teaching, the first job I had was at Williams College, and they wanted to put me in faculty housing on Cecil Street, and I said no. I said, no, I'm not living there. I won't be able to tell my students where I live. Anyway, so Sisyphean. But there is this reclaiming of a history. Quite seriously, Tavares, is this reclaiming of a history that has been repressed because of power. Who is in charge? Tell me how you classify, and I will tell you who you are. I'm not inside this book because someone or a board of someone has decided that I don't warrant to be in it.
So do you remember the question about whether it was a real book or not?
Yeah, I do remember it.
Well, I think the reason I asked that question is because I think it's a lot of it's illusion anyway.
Illusion?
Yeah. And I think that's why I go back to a thought experiment. Like, it's a way to think about the world, right? Therefore, to me, the book is not real. In the sense that it's not about the book. It's about the way, a way of thinking which cannot be taken from you. Cannot be stolen from you, cannot be hidden from you. It is now in you.
And once you begin on that kind of adventure, it's sort of, you become insatiable for it.
Yeah, it's like, if Michael Jackson sang Thriller on a stage and he had the lyrics on stage with him as he was singing, you don't need the lyrics anymore. At least not on a piece of paper. I mean, I don't mean any disrespect to you.
No. I have a lot of pieces of paper here. God, do I. I hope someday I come on stage without pieces of paper, but it hasn't yet happened. Somehow they keep me company. There's this wonderful entry also that I love, that maybe we can talk about a little bit, because the book isn't just people at all. It's also something like sage philosophy. Why do you laugh? Why do you smile?
I smile because how much art do we believe is about people?
Rather than collectives, or
one of the clock of the long now. Have you heard of this clock? Have you heard of this clock?
The clock of the long now?
Yeah, the 10,000-year-old clock.
I have not.
A bunch of rich guys are building a clock in Cambridge. And I don't mean that pejoratively, a bunch of rich guys. Let's rephrase that. Can we rewind the tape? A few distinguished gentlemen. They're building this clock, but the premise of the clock is something that I find inspiring, which is to reset the way that human beings think about time. Because we imagine time in a 85 to 95 chunk span, which means we're not able to imagine the world outside of our lifetimes. So when you and I are gone, we're not thinking about what happens after. And the clock of the long now is a kind of metaphor about how we can exercise a more expansive way of thinking about the world outside of our own mortality, right? Because I think that this kind of philosophy is what we attribute to a lot of the current conditions. Like we're thinking about, we can only think about the next, whatever, however many years you have left, for example, or assume we have left. And I really love that idea because I think it decentralizes, the 85-year ability to think about the big challenges we have in the world. Because the challenges are insurmountable. But if you have a bunch of folks thinking about them like I just got to do this in the next election cycle, or I got to do this in the next, time that a new president of a company is exchanged, then you end up with this short form thinking, which I think we now know enough to know that it's not good for the world. That thinking about these things in short form is not good for the world.
I often like to quote this line of Jonas Salk, who asked a very simple question. It's been on my mind a lot, Tavares. He asks a question which I find so poignant, which is, are we good ancestors?
So when we met earlier, I asked you about Saul's journey to Damascus.
You didn't ask me. You came in and you said, do you know the story of Saul's journey to Damascus? You didn't say, hello, Paul. You said, do you know Saul's story, journey to Damascus? And my answer was very short, no. So tell me, where are you going with this?
I was hoping that you would help me.
Okay.
This is a story. It's one of those, biblical stories where there's a point of enlightenment, if you will, if I can use that word. Can I use that?
Well, you can use it, and it's particularly an interesting word to use in the context of our conversation, but also in the context of an undertaking like an encyclopedia of invisibility, because encyclopedias in their high point, thinking about Diderot and d'Alembert and others, were an undertaking of the Enlightenment. Anyway.
He was going to Damascus to do the bad thing, and as the story goes, God comes from the sky as in the form of sun and light, so enlightenment might make sense in the context of this story. And the light blinds him, and he's changed, and he becomes the Apostle Paul, like your name.
So I'm not sure what we were saying just before, but I will continue a little bit with sage philosophy because it's so interesting. The entry reads, it's a philosophical tradition and methodology premised on interviewing the wise and respected elders of a society, uses examples of Heraclitus, Socrates, and Thales, developed by, again, a completely new person to me, Odera Oruka, a philosophy professor of the University of Nairobi. So this notion of, well, Terry Tempest Williams, when I had a conversation with her on a series I did during the pandemic called The Quarantine Tapes, made a distinction which was so beautiful between the elders and the elderly. And this reliance on the elders seems to me to be filled with meaning, and filled with meaning in the context of this undertaking. Now, this undertaking is so, it's such a promise and such a metaphor, but is it also there for it to be used? Because when you see the Encyclopedia of Invisibility, there is this paradox, and the paradox is that you can't touch it. So it becomes kind of an art object.
How does that make you feel?
Pardon?
How does that make you feel?
Like I want to break that plexiglass.
I think going back to sage philosophy, but also the encyclopedia, I think I've said a bunch of times that I don't know that it's meant to be taken literally. And I think that's frustrating, perhaps.
It is but frustration is a good thing, like boredom. I mean, it's necessary. To be frustrated, let's say, by an artist is a good thing.
Yeah.
The irritation is helpful.
I think when you brought up sage philosophy, this entry, it made me think of Shabba Ranks.
Of?
Shabba Ranks. Do you know what that is?
No.
He wears 2 gold chains. He has a gold tooth. And he's like a he's big. I don't know how come you don't know him. You should know what? Him.
I always say I have holes in my culture so it can breathe. I don't, So there's so many things. I mean, Tavares, if we get to know each other better, you'll be amazed.
I'll play I'll play a song from him when I see you tomorrow.
Please.
He has a song called Respect. And it's a song that reminds me of sage philosophy because it is, in dancehall, there's all of the foundation artists who helped to create dancehall. And in the song, he's talking about the various artists that you need to pay honor to. And sage philosophy is a part of that history. I think as a much younger artist, I think it was difficult for me to see sage philosophy. I think I was like a bull. And I think when you're trying to create space for oneself, I think sage philosophy is like, respect for the who again? Because I feel like in order to be a young artist, I think you need to be a little disrespectful. And I think you can then find respect later on for the foundation artists, the people who allow you to be where you are today because their sacrifices, the things they did. So Shabba, you should look him up. Shabba Ranks.
In closing, I'd like to bring up an elder who matters to you and matters to me too. I'd like to play Sea Grapes if we could. The classics can console, but not enough. Brought to mind a line of Iris Murdoch I always loved, where she says, "Only the very greatest art invigorates without consoling." Wondering how this reverberates with you, Tavares.
I think I've been asking myself the question, what is art for? And do we know what to do? Like by we, the collective we. I recently had an exhibition in London, and there was a bit of performance in the exhibition, and there was a roughly 68-year-old woman that held the hands of a performer at the end in tears. And the performer graciously met back up with the lady at the end of that session in the exhibition space. And they had a long exchange, and then the performer then asked the lady, how did she find out about the exhibition? She didn't feel like the conventional, art, typecast audience member. And it turns out that this lady had lost a son like a week and a half before. And the title of the exhibition in London was called There's Light Somewhere. And she'd come to this exhibition because of the title of the exhibition, In Search of Light. I think there's a certain bigness of imagination that is scalable for all of us if we just allow ourselves to find it.
Thank you very much.